In the late 1940s, entire black neighborhoods built their own homes from scratch with no loans and no contractors, while local ordinances tried to make that work illegal. Thousands created generational wealth with their bare hands, yet almost no trace of these methods exists today. How did families once succeed where so many now struggle? The real story has been buried. Its consequences still shape who owns a home in America. In Woodmere, Ohio, the sound of hammers and saws echoed across empty lots in the summer of 1944. Black families, many recently arrived from the South, gathered every Saturday and Sunday to pour foundations, frame walls, and lift roof beams. There were no contractors or bank inspectors, just neighbors, friends, and relatives working side by side. Township notes from that year record a sudden rise in building permits, most of them issued to black men with no formal construction background. Oral recollections describe how these families pooled what little money they had to buy secondhand lumber, salvaged bricks, and nails by the pound. Children hauled water in buckets from nearby wells while mothers prepared meals for the crews. On communal build days, as many as 20 men would rotate between work sites. If a wall needed raising, everyone stopped what they were doing and helped. Some learned to mix concrete by watching older neighbors, memorizing the rough ratio of sand, gravel, and water. Others passed around dog-eared manuals or shared tips picked up from jobs in local factories. There was no blueprint except the determination to finish before winter. By the end of 1944, 15 families had moved into homes they built themselves. Each house stood as proof of what could be accomplished without loans or outside approval. The sense of accomplishment ran deep. Men who had been denied union cards or skilled jobs now called themselves builders. Women stitched curtains for windows that had never belonged to them before. Children slept in bedrooms their fathers had framed with their own hands. The movement gathered momentum, drawing more families to Woodmere and inspiring similar efforts in nearby towns. The township records show a steady stream of applications and informal agreements, evidence of a community moving forward together. For a brief moment, hope outpaced the barriers. The collective ambition was clear: to claim a piece of land and build not just a house, but a future. City officials in Woodmere did not wait long to push back. By the spring of 1946, the Township Council passed a slate of new building ordinances. The language was precise and unforgiving. Every new house required a $1,000 bond. Construction had to be finished in under 12 months. And any pause in work longer than 48 hours would void the permit. The use of secondhand materials, once the backbone of these community builds, was now strictly banned. On paper, these rules applied to everyone. In practice, enforcement landed squarely on the black families who had made Woodmere their home. Police began patrolling construction sites, checking permits and bond receipts. Strickland, an experienced builder and one of the first to lead weekend crews, was arrested on a Tuesday morning for using reclaimed bricks. Charles and Edward Taylor, brothers known for their skill with framing, found themselves in custody after township inspectors claimed their lumber was not up to code. Their names appeared in the arrest dockets, alongside charges that carried steep fines and the threat of jail time. The bond requirement alone was 5 times higher than what white builders paid in nearby towns. Records from the county courthouse show that between 1946 and 1948, at least 8 black builders were detained under the new ordinances. Some spent nights in the holding cell, unable to pay the bond. Others watched as their half-finished homes were condemned or dismantled. In 1948, a local judge upheld the township's authority to enforce these rules, closing the last legal avenue for appeal. The message was clear: self-built homes would not be tolerated, not if they were built by black hands. The crackdown forced many to abandon their projects or move away entirely, yet the determination to build did not vanish. Instead, the threat of arrest drove knowledge sharing and training into private spaces, church basements, back rooms, and quiet gatherings after dark. The fight for a home continued, but now it had to stay out of sight. Church doors opened wide on weeknights, long after the last hymn faded. Folding chairs filled the basement, and men arrived in work clothes, carrying battered toolboxes and notebooks. These spaces became classrooms, where faith and practical skill blended with purpose. There was no tuition, no formal curriculum, just a rotating cast of instructors, many with day jobs as janitors, porters, or steelworkers who spent evenings teaching what they knew. On Mondays, one might find a lesson in framing a doorway, the instructor sketching angles on a chalkboard salvaged from a closed school. Tuesdays were for wiring a socket, with a demonstration lamp wired live before a silent crowd. Sometimes a local electrician or plumber would drop by, sharing tips on pipe threading or safe fuse replacement. Church bulletins listed upcoming topics alongside prayer requests. The schedule was relentless, 3 nights a week, every week, with extra sessions before spring building season. Tool libraries grew from congregation donations, hammers, saws, and levels, each marked with a family's name and checked out like hymnals. These tools passed from hand to hand, their handles worn smooth by dozens of different grips. The atmosphere was serious but hopeful. Men who had never been allowed into union apprenticeships now measured, cut, and assembled practice frames under watchful eyes. Mistakes were corrected gently, with a nod or a quiet word. Younger boys lingered at the edges, soaking up knowledge that would one day be theirs. The Opportunities Industrialization Center, founded in the 1960s, later formalized this model, but in these years, the blueprint was simple. Learn enough to build, teach enough to help others do the same. Skills multiplied, spreading through the congregation and beyond, until nearly every man could handle a saw or wire a switch. In these basements, technical competence became a form of resistance and a path to shelter. Roosevelt Barnes Sr. arrived in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in the early 1950s with nothing but a battered toolbox and a head full of skills picked up from years on factory floors and railroad crews. He never held a union card, but he could read blueprints, measure a lot with a single glance, and run a crew through every stage of building a house. Property records from the era list his name on deed after deed, and Barnes was not just building for his own family. Over 2 decades, he helped raise more than a dozen homes on the city's south side, each one a testament to what peer-to-peer training could accomplish. Barnes's story began in the basements and back rooms where he first taught others to cut rafters and set block. He was not a preacher or a teacher by trade, but neighbors remember him as the man who could fix anything and explain it twice as fast. When a young man needed to learn to hang a door, Barnes would show him once and then stand back, arms folded, until the job was done right. Those who learned from him went on to teach others, spreading practical knowledge through the neighborhood like a current. By the late 1960s, the Barnes family portfolio included not just their own home but several rental houses, each built with sweat and shared labor. Informal teaching became the backbone of this small network, with notes scrawled on scrap paper, supply lists written in the margins of church bulletins, and weekend work crews organized by word of mouth. The skills passed from one hand to the next, turning ordinary men into builders and landlords. City directories from 1972 show the Barneses as property owners in a time when black families faced steep odds even getting a mortgage. The evidence remains in the houses themselves. Solid, modest, and still standing. Each one is a lesson in applied mastery. proof that the knowledge traded in those makeshift classrooms did not just stay in the basement. It changed the face of a neighborhood, one house at a time. Salvaging became a science in the hands of men who could stretch a dollar farther than most could imagine. When a demolition permit was posted on a downtown storefront, word traveled quickly. By dusk, a small crew, sometimes led by someone like Roosevelt Barnes Sr., would arrive with pry bars and wheelbarrows, ready to claim anything that could be reused. They hauled away bricks, window frames, even floorboards, stacking them neatly in church basements or backyards until the next build. These materials carried stories of old factories and shuttered schools, now set for a second life as living rooms and porches. Bulk buying was another strategy. Church ledgers from the 1950s list pooled orders for nails, tar paper, and glass, sometimes enough to serve a dozen families. Pastors negotiated with local suppliers for discounts, promising steady business in exchange for fairer prices. Each family contributed what they could, cash, labor, or supplies, and in return received an equal share of the haul. The economics were simple. Buying together saved money, but it also built trust and obligation. If one man's house needed a roof, others showed up with ladders and shingles. When the next project broke ground, the favor was returned. Labor was organized with the same sense of mutual benefit. Crew rotations ensured no one was left to finish a house alone. Saturday morning started with a list, names penciled next to addresses, showing who would mix mortar, who would frame, and who would run errands for the day. Experienced hands taught newcomers on the job, passing down tips about leveling joists or bracing beams. The work was slow, but every hour invested meant less debt and more control. No one paid a contractor's fee or interest on a loan. The only currency was sweat and time. Over months, sometimes years, these houses rose one wall at a time, each nail and brick a small act of defiance against exclusion. The result was more than shelter. It was ownership, earned collectively and protected by the memory of shared labor. Mr. Williams' house stands on the corner of Maple and 6th. Its concrete steps still smooth after 70 years. The secret, neighbors said, was in his mix. Instead of guessing, he kept a notebook tucked in his shirt pocket, the pages stained with cement dust and numbers. For every 3 parts gravel, he measured 2 parts sand, then added 1 part Portland cement, a 3-to-2-to-1 ratio he swore by. Water came last, poured slow, so the mix stayed thick enough to hold shape, but wet enough to set without cracks. He would test each batch by pressing a trowel into the mound. If the imprint held, it was ready. Williams insisted on pouring his footings wider and deeper than code required, sometimes twice as thick as the city minimum. He called it insurance against the world. The foundation walls, poured by hand in wooden forms, rose straight and true. Lumber for framing did not come from the yard pre-cut to length. Instead, he and his sons spent evenings in the backyard, sawing each stud from rough boards salvaged from freight crates. They picked pieces with the tightest grain, rejecting anything with a knot or split. Where most builders used 2x4s, Williams used 2x6s set 16 inches apart. Floor joists were doubled under heavy rooms, and attic rafters were braced with extra cross ties scavenged from old barn beams. Inside, door frames and window sills were milled by hand, sanded smooth, and sealed with linseed oil. Nails were driven in at opposing angles, a trick learned from a railroad foreman to keep them from working loose over time. Even the roof shingles were laid in overlapping rows. Each one was checked for a tight seal. Inspectors who visited years later found no sag in the floors and no cracks in the walls. The house had weathered storms, hard winters, and decades of use without a single structural failure. Williams built as if his family's future depended on every board and every bucket of concrete, because it did. The result was a home that asked for little maintenance and gave back generations of shelter, standing as quiet proof that careful hands and forward thinking could outlast any hardship. Federal housing policy began to shift in the late 1940s, opening doors that had long been locked. The Fair Housing Act and the gradual end of formal segregation allowed Black families to access neighborhoods and resources once off limits. Mortgage financing, previously denied or made impossible by redlining, became available through the Federal Housing Administration, though not without hurdles. FHA loans, introduced in the 1930s and expanded after World War II, fueled a nationwide surge in home construction. Suburbs grew rapidly as builders embraced mass production methods, offering new houses at scale and on credit. For the first time, some Black families could apply for government-backed mortgages instead of relying solely on cash or informal agreements. This new access brought relief, but it also changed the equation. Contractors and developers moved into areas where self-built homes had been the norm, offering speed and convenience in exchange for debt. The appeal of a finished house, ready to move in and financed over decades, drew many away from the old ways of building together. As the market shifted, the cost of land and materials climbed, and the skills once passed from father to son began to fade. The promise of easier ownership came with new risks and new dependencies. Urban renewal swept through Black neighborhoods in the 1960s, bulldozing homes that had been built brick by brick without a penny owed to the bank. City planners called it progress, but census records tell a different story. Families who once passed down houses free and clear found themselves displaced, forced into rentals, or burdened by new mortgages. The old model, where every nail and board translated to full ownership, gave way to a system built on debt. As the culture shifted toward college degrees and white-collar jobs, fewer young men learned the trades that had once been a source of pride and security. By the 1970s, the percentage of Black households owning their homes had dropped to just over 44%, while the share of total housing wealth held by Black families stands at only 5.9% today. Generations who once built equity with their own hands now face a cycle of borrowing and repayment, with little left to show for decades of work. The promise of stability vanished, replaced by a widening gap between what was once possible and what remains. Today, Black homeownership stands at just 44%, the lowest of any racial group in America, a gap wider now than in 1960. As generational wealth slips further out of reach, the knowledge once forged in community basements and backyard job sites is nearly lost. What we build and what we forget still shapes who gets to call a house a home. Share your thoughts on rebuilding what matters most.